Hi, everyone, and welcome to the final in our series of webinars on how to develop good research proposals for the IGC. I'm Shahid Vaziralli, head of the research program at the IGC, and today we'll be doing two things. First, I'll be sharing with you some information on our upcoming call for proposals for early career researchers. And then we'll welcome Matthieu Teachout, Director of Research and Policy at the IGC, who will be sharing with us some of his tips for writing good research proposals. Following that, we'll go through some of the questions that were submitted by audience members prior to the webinar. And then we'll finally open it up to questions that are submitted during the webinar itself. So if you have a question, please type it out in the Q&A box on Zoom. And we'll try to address as many of these as possible in the last 10 to 15 minutes. So these webinars are being recorded and will be posted on the IGC website as well. So I'd strongly encourage everyone to view them again before beginning their work on their proposals. So let me just share my screen here. Yeah. So we're going to be holding a call for proposals coming up soon. The window will open in the third week, most likely the third week of November. So the date is yet to be decided exactly, but it'll be somewhere between the 20th and 25th of, September. So that's this month. And it'll be open for about 7 weeks and will run up until early November. And then we expect decisions to be made sometime in January and applicants to be notified kind of shortly thereafter. So this is a call that we've not run before at the IGC. It's focused exclusively on early career researchers. And by that, we mean either PhD students or researchers who have got 5 years or less of work experience following their PhDs. So the lead PI on each proposal has to be an early career researcher, how we define an early career researcher. But the composition of the team is not does not have to be exclusively early career. So we're saying the lead PI has to be an early career researcher, so either a PhD student or someone with 5 or less years of work experience. But then other team members may have more work experience. Awards will be capped at £20,000. But we expect that the average amount given per proposal will be between £10,000 to £15,000. So given the budget that we have, we think that we're going to give out about 30 to 40 awards this year. Looking at our kind of past historical success rate, about 1 in every 4 proposals submitted gets selected. So it's a highly competitive call. It always has been at the IGC. So I wouldn't be too disappointed if you don't get through this time. There'll be further opportunities down the line as well. And we're doing as much as we can, through this webinar series, through our matchmaking initiatives, to try and provide as much feedback as possible and as much guidance as possible on proposal development. So our focus areas for this call for proposals will be the traditional 4 IGC themes: state effectiveness, firms and productivity, cities and energy. But we will have a kind of an additional focus on sustainable growth as well. So when you're developing your proposals and you're thinking of ideas within these 4 themes, think about how your research idea is relevant to inclusive and sustainable growth. We will have guidance documents for you on the website around our research strategy. We will have evidence papers put up on the website as well. So I'd strongly encourage you to go through these to get a better understanding of the details and the nuances around what our research priorities are. They've been fed in by our research program directors and by our country teams as well. And so these will be updated over the next couple of weeks and will be ready to go by the time we open up the call. Another important point that I would really like to emphasize is that we very strongly encourage applicants to work in IGC countries. These are countries where the IGC has a resident team, which provides researchers with a whole host of advantages as opposed to when they're working in a non-IGC country. IGC country teams can help connect you to policymakers, can help connect you to other researchers who may be willing to either review your proposal, give you feedback, or even collaborate with you. They may have access to data sets that you may not have access to. And our country economists are very proactive and will also take time to review your proposals and provide you with feedback and give you an understanding of what the resident country team's priorities are. So it's very important that as you develop your research proposals, please get in touch with the IGC country office at an early stage. So we will be accepting proposals from non-IGC countries as well, but these will be limited to only 10% of our commissioning budget this year, which will end up being around 3 to 4 proposals. So we'll only give, so the benchmark for non-IGC country proposals is going to be even higher and even more competitive because it's going to be a much more limited amount of money that we have allocated to these projects. If you are in a non-IGC country and you want to submit a proposal for research in a non-IGC country, then please make sure that your proposal shows strong policy engagement ex ante at the time of writing the proposal, and also displays strong relevance for IGC countries as well. Yeah, and then another thing that we're doing this year is we want to make sure that we get in as many proposals and approve as many proposals as possible from locally based researchers. And so we're making a conscious effort to make sure that at least 50% of all our projects approved this year will include at least one locally based researcher. And finally, this is just to show you what applications will be assessed on. This is the way we've done it in the past as well. We're looking for projects that show strong policy relevance, but that also push the knowledge frontier in that particular subject area. And so academic impact is equally important. It has to build on the literature. And then finally, we're looking for projects that have sound research designs and that are able to effectively and accurately answer the research question. We want projects that align with IGC research priorities, that engage with local researchers and local institutions, and that finally are also cost effective and show good value for money. So I'll stop there. I'll pass on to Matthieu, who will then give us some of his tips on how to write a successful research proposal. If you have any questions after both these presentations, please continue to type them out in the Q&A box, and we'll try and get to them at the end of the session. So Matthieu, let me just unshare my screen. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Okay, does this work? Okay. So hi, everyone. I'm going to try to give a bit of tips on how to write a successful proposal. In the previous webinars with Oriana Bandiera and Chris Woodruff, they discussed a bit kind of more the content of a research proposal, really the idea that behind, stressing the importance of the idea, the research question, and the methodology behind the project. I'm not going to go over too much over that again, but instead focus more on how you present your project. I'm going to start with the presumption that you have a good idea and a good methodology to address the question, and then think how you should present a bit your proposal when applying for funding. So I think a good thing to always start from is to think about what do reviewers look for in a proposal. So Shahid mentioned just now kind of the criteria for the upcoming call. Typically, reviewers look for things that are aligned with the research strategy of the IGC. So he mentioned the 4 themes, and the evidence paper and the research strategy are a very good source of to try to understand really the research strategy of the IGC. The second criteria is typically that your proposal needs to show that it's unique, that there's a bit of novelty in it, that it builds on existing literature while still being different, that it's an interesting setting and an interesting research question. The third, which is more about the methodology, is to show that it's going to be well executed, that you're going to generate robust evidence that we can believe in, that the methodology is clear and sound, and that eventually one can trust the results that will come out of your project. The fourth, which is very specific to the IGC, is policy engagement and impact. So not just why the question that you're answering is policy relevant, but also actually how you think you can achieve impact directly through the research project itself. So you can refer specifically to the webinar that we held last week or 2 weeks ago on policy engagement and co-generation at the IGC. And the fifth, which is important, is value for money. For a given project and a given scope of a project, you need to have a budget that sounds reasonable for what you're trying to do. Okay, so the typical, the upcoming proposal form for the early career researcher call that will open in September, but I think most funders have typically the same structure, adopt the same structure, is typically organized around these questions. So the first is always the project summary. The second is the research design. The third is typically kind of what is the academic innovation or behind the project. Then the relevance to the kind of policy in general. And then that's more specific to the IGC is kind of what policy stakeholder engagement you have. And typically you're also asked to submit the budget for the proposal as well. So today I'll focus exclusively on the project summary, but there's a lot to learn from that also applies to the other section. So this is eventually just a summary of kind of what the other questions ask for. So just a quick point on the others. On the research design is essentially just much more details about the design of the project than you provide in the summary. The research aim and the academic innovation, I would say just structure it the same way that you would structure a literature review in the introduction of a published paper. So essentially, what is the related literature, how you build on it, and how you're different from the existing literature. So this is just why is the question important for policy as well, and it isn't just an interesting research question, but it can also lead to interesting policy insight. Then again, to stress the policy stakeholder engagement, this is something quite specific to the IGC, and you should refer to the policy engagement webinar that we held. The key point that I want to emphasize further that Shahid mentioned already is talk to the IGC country teams. When we open the call, we're going to have guidance in terms of our country teams' priorities. We'll provide emails of our country teams, and you should aim to send maybe just a half-pager of your research idea to start engaging and discussing it with our country teams. And then again, the budget. I know sometimes it's a bit unclear how exactly you're going to spend your budget on the project or exactly what amount you need, but it doesn't matter. You need to really think through with the information that you have today about how you're going to do your project and what is the budget you need and the broad categories in which you would spend the money. So if it is for enumerators, if it is for hiring a research assistant, you need to have that idea already, even if there can be kind of marginal movement between budget items as the project moves forward. Okay, so the main tip for writing a proposal is don't forget that you're writing for someone who does not know anything about your project, but needs to understand all of it in less than 1 minute. So kind of we see there's a very high volume of proposals that are submitted in the call, and reviewers very rapidly skim through, in particular, the project summary, and they need to have very quickly a very good understanding of what research question you're trying to answer and what you're going to do to find an answer to that question. So the key thing is being simple, being very clear, being very precise and not vague in terms of kind of what you plan to do, but at the same time be very concise. Like each sentence must have a kind of really a clear meaning and a clear message. Okay, so diving into the project summary, at the IGC, we recommend adopting the following structure, which is first having an outline of the context and the primary motivation for the study. The second being the policy relevance of the project and the expected impact. And the third being a non-technical summary of the research design or your approach. I won't go too much into the policy relevance of the project and the expected impact, and dive more into kind of the motivation and the summary of the research design. So in terms of the motivation, I think should always be structured in the following way. Start with the very high level statements and gradually narrow it down all the way to your research question. The end of the motivation should be your research question. As much as possible, try to motivate your statements in the motivation by existing literature. And again, just to refer to what Chris Woodruff said in his webinar, like if you provide just citations of papers that are kind of common knowledge, people will clearly understand what idea you try to build from. So the citations can sometimes be more important than just the sentence. And then the research question should be very clear, very specific. Don't shoot for the stars, shoot for a reasonable research question that you can answer through your project. And then the non-technical summary of the research design and your approach. I think you should maybe practice in thinking about how you would explain what you do in your project in 1 or 2 sentences maximum, or how you would maybe explain it to a friend in an elevator. So kind of you should be able to convey the main thing that you plan to do in your project in very, very few sentences. Now it a bit depends on your design. If you're trying to have a causal estimate or shows kind of that the correlation is causal, you should clearly explain why your identification strategy is good, and do it without math. Don't try to explain with equations. Try to explain just intuitively why the identification strategy works, why the counterfactual that you have in mind is a good one. If it's an RCT, try to describe the interventions, the sample, and kind of these details. If it's just descriptive analysis, describe why the data that you're building is unique, or the data you're going to dive into is quite unique and offers a new perspective into a specific issue. If you're going more into a structural model, then explain what the main elements of the model will be and how you're planning to identify the key parameters in your structural model. So I thought rather than a very long speech on tips, it might be good to give a couple of examples of successful proposals. So this one on the left, I'll just go through it. But the yellow part I think describes well the motivation, and the green part describes well the research question. So just reading out loud. Informal taxation, which often involves contributing labor towards local public goods provision, is a frequently overlooked source of local public finance in developing countries. And this is a statement which just says informal taxation is important. And then there's a few more details about that first statement. And then it ends with, however, in most countries, the incidence of informal taxation is regressive. Poor households often contribute more work hours than better off households, and at times the most disadvantaged individuals within household also contribute the most to informal taxation. So this is a very simple motivation that says formal taxation is important, but it is very unfair. And then the question is also very clear. This project examines whether in formalizing an informal tax by measuring citizens' contribution in issuing receipts, I'll keep the project anonymous for now, can reduce its regressive nature and improve access to public services. Very simple, very clear. You quickly understand why it's important and what exactly the project is going to do, or what research question they're going to answer. This is another example. Air quality has become a pressing concern in many developing countries, particularly in South Asia. There is a huge human capital cost of air pollution. It has been documented, and there's a lot of citations of that. There remain major gaps in our understanding of the effects of air pollution, and more importantly, the ability and willingness of individuals and firms to avoid these damages. And then, so that's kind of the motivation. We know pollution and air quality is important. It has a dire impact, in particular in South Asia. And then moving on to the research question, what is the effect of incomplete defensive investments, so air purifiers that reduce exposure to air pollution for only part of the day? And second, how does information provision about damages from air pollution changes the willingness to pay for defensive investment? So again, there's a clear motivation, an issue that's important, that is then narrowed down to specifically kind of defensive investment or air purifiers. And then there's a clear research question, which is about evaluating the impact of these and how information provision is going to affect the take-up of people of these devices. And then finally, kind of a couple of examples of research design and approach, how you summarize this. So this is an example for a causal estimate. So again, highlighting the part in yellow, you quickly get what the project is going to do. So in a country, localities switch from traditional governance to another form of governance at a population threshold. And so what we'll try to do is understand kind of how governance impacts development outcomes by surveying localities just below and just above the population threshold. So by reading this sentence, you understand that it's going to be a regression discontinuity design right around the threshold at which there's a switch in governance. This is an example of an RCT. Very quickly, it says it's going to be an RCT, and then it's a quick description of the interventions. This is a project that is purely descriptive, that just provides descriptive evidence. And very quickly, you can identify what we're going to do is construct a comprehensive database mapping the sectoral distribution of services employment. The database will establish new standardized facts. Quickly, you get kind of what the project is going to do and their main contribution. And this is an example of a structural model. We use a general equilibrium macroeconomic model of occupational choice with fictional labor markets. Two key general equilibrium jobs. So we will focus on two key general equilibrium search externalities. So this is what I said before. If the model is structural, you should explain the key elements of the model so that you quickly grasp that. And then to discipline the magnitudes of these general equilibrium forces, we plan to estimate the model to match key features of the job search process. So this is exactly explains how they're going to estimate the parameters of their model, their structural model. So I hope this makes sense and these examples are practical enough. Given that the video will be on the website, you can always refer to this. You can always look up these slides again and to see a bit more into these examples. Shahid, back to you. I'll stop sharing screen.
Thanks, Matthieu. So what we're going to do now is just go through some questions that were submitted by registered applicants for the webinar prior to the webinar. So we received a lot of questions from people who registered. We've selected a few that we'll get to now that I think will be useful for us to address for the benefit of the audience. And then we'll go through some questions that were submitted during the webinar as well. So I'll direct some of these at Matthieu. So one question we received from Irfan Sofi from the Islamic University of Science and Tech in Jammu and Kashmir is, do you consider research proposals that aim to contribute empirically but not theoretically to a particular topic? And also inversely, do you consider research proposals that contribute theoretically but lacking in derivation of a mathematical model?
So we have very rarely, I don't think ever, funded projects that are pure theory, so just a model. On the other end, the vast majority of the projects we fund don't necessarily have a mathematical model in them, or just purely empirical. So you don't need to have a theory behind. We focus very much on empirical micro. So, and if your question is purely empirical, that's totally fine.
Yeah, and I'll just stress on the micro part as well. Most of the projects that we've commissioned in the past are in the microeconomics field, and so very rarely do we commission macro projects. Another question we got from Miat Mon, who is a graduate student and independent researcher, asks, given that there are not that much administrative data available in Myanmar, it is challenging for us to conduct quantitative research at the moment. In such cases, what kind of research methodology is IGC looking for?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and something I understood because I used to do a lot of research in Myanmar as well. It's obviously very challenging in the current environment to do survey work, but I think there are administrative data that have been built over the years, and in particular, the country teams has access to existing data sets that they've collected in the past. So I think it is still possible to do research there, building on kind of existing administrative data as well as publicly available data such as satellite data to look at things, for example, as deforestation in Myanmar, which is a very important issue and can be done without necessarily having admin data. So it's obviously challenging in that country to do survey work, but it is, I think, possible still to do admin data and publicly available data work. And in that case, I would strongly recommend to get in touch with the country team.
Yeah, and that goes for other IGC countries as well. So if you're unsure whether a particular data set is available, or you're unsure whether you can get access to a particular data set, then please, we encourage you to get in touch with the country team. They can guide you on that. Anvesha Basu from IGIDR in Mumbai asks, how methodologically intensive do the proposals need to be? Can the proposals be just a research idea, or does it have to be detailed with descriptions of the data and methodology that one intends to use?
Yes, so it has to contain a clear description of how you're going to execute the project. So it cannot just be a research idea or a research question. It has to be it has to have all the details of how you would execute the project. There can be a couple of changes down the road depending on issues with some data, or with kind of as the project progresses, the methodology changes a bit. But you need to show what is at that point in time how you plan to execute the project. I would say if you just have a research idea and you have a tentative plan of how you would execute that, you don't necessarily have the data. I think early on, when the call for proposal opens, send just a half pager to our country team saying, I'm interested in that issue in this country. I think I would go in that direction to answer that research question. What do you think? And to try to develop the proposal a bit further before the deadline for submitting the applications.
Yeah. Enoch Bulime from Economic Policy Research Center asks, would it be ideal to undertake a preliminary analysis of the proposed study before embarking on writing the proposal? There is a tendency by some researchers to work backwards these days.
Yes, so we have in the past, and in particular for this upcoming call, funded a lot of scoping work or pilot work that is a project in its very early phases. We don't fund desk research. I think this was one of the messages that Chris Woodruff mentioned. The desk research you should do before you apply for funding at the IGC. But we can fund kind of scoping work in the sense of, I'm thinking about doing this intervention in the form of an RCT. I would like to pilot it small scale, or I would like to do a round of survey first in the country or in that population to understand whether my intervention would be meaningful. That's totally fine, and we funded a lot of scoping or pilot work in that sense.
Okay.
So it's now my turn to revert questions to you. So Tukai Mbegalo from Tanzania asked whether the applicants must come from IGC countries, must be resident in IGC countries.
Yeah, no, applicants can come from anywhere. We strongly encourage research to be executed in IGC countries and to be about policy issue in IGC resident countries, but researchers can come from anywhere in the world.
Then Sadia Hussein asks, how important would COVID protocols be in designing your survey design estimation strategy? I.e. social network design seem difficult to implement in such a context.
Yeah, so I mean, we commissioned a few research projects over the past year during the COVID pandemic, and we asked applicants that were accepted to provide us with a description of how they would execute their research under the COVID restrictions in their country and execute their research in a safe and responsible manner. And we'll continue to do that because the COVID pandemic seems to be going up and down in developing countries, certainly. And with vaccination rates quite low as well, this would certainly be an issue. So yes, executing your research, especially field research, in an ethical and responsible way and that complies with COVID guidelines would be very much something that we look for.
Okay, then Antonia Odelay asks, is research design necessary when one is to use secondary data?
Yeah, research design is important whether you're using primary data or secondary data. If it's secondary data or administrative data, your research design still needs to explain how you're going to use the data and analyze the data to answer your research question. So it's equally relevant.
Then Myat Mon asked that, I think it's not phrased properly, but I think the question is, can IGC funding be used for data collection in IGC countries?
Yes.
Then Basil Jogra asks, how likely is it for IGC to fund a replication study, especially when it has never been done before in the country of interest?
Yeah, I don't know, Matthieu, if you want to take that one. We haven't funded that many replication studies in the past. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure.
So I think if it's just pure replication, you're taking the same project, you're doing exactly the same thing. It has a low chance of going through, I would say, in the sense of it's not being very competitive. If it is pure replication, but it is because you have an interaction with a policymaker who specifically asked to have that work replicated in the country, then has a much higher chance of going through. And then if you're replicating a project but adding even a very small component of novelty into it, and you have a strong policymaker demand for the project, I would say then you have a very high chance of going through. We've had projects that are not exact replications, but are close replications of existing projects that are done in a new country, but with strong policymaker demand. Then these projects typically go through. Sorry, so back to me. So someone asked whether you can be eligible for getting funding if you work for an NGO rather than, I think, a research organization.
Yeah, typically, no. If the NGO collaborates with an academic institution, and we've had many such instances in the past, then that's fine. But I don't think we've funded many, if any, applications that are purely from an NGO. So I would encourage you to collaborate with an academic partner.
So I think this is a question maybe that's been asked in the past, but probably worth saying it again. There's the IGC fund proposals that are being partially funded by other grantors. For instance, if it's a project that has a fairly large budget and the researchers are applying for multiple smaller grants, is that something the IGC would potentially fund? Yeah,
so the short answer is yes, we've funded projects in the past that form a component of a larger project budget, so part funded projects. But what I will say is that if that is the case for your project, say you've got £100,000 already funded by another funder, and you're looking for an additional, 30 or 40,000 pounds, and you're applying to the IGC, or 20,000 pounds in this case due to the cap. We will take into consideration the marginal value added by the IGC's funding. So if the money that you're asking for is being used in a way that is valuable from an academic and policy perspective and adds incremental value to the questions that you're asking, then yes, we will consider funding it. So for example, if you're running a randomized trial and you think that there are interesting questions that need to be asked, if you extend the trial by an additional year, because you're looking at medium-term or long-term effects of something, and that's academically and academically interesting and interesting from a policy perspective as well, then yes, we would consider that. Or if you want to add a new treatment arm, something like that, we would consider funding something like that.
There's a question about the type of contract that we issue after for the project between institutional versus independent or individual. Is it okay if the researchers and the PIs are all independent researchers without any institutional affiliation?
So we would strongly encourage applicants to be affiliated with an institution, preferably an academic institution. If you're a PhD student or an early career researcher, the institution would be the one that is employing you. We do fund applications from individual/independent researchers on an exceptional basis. But if you are an independent researcher, I would strongly encourage you to partner with another researcher who is affiliated with an institution.
Sorry. So there are a couple of questions about the countries, the IGC countries.
Yeah.
You can refer. We'll have that video posted on the website very quickly, so you'll be able to refer to that.
Yeah. We'll have guidance on the call put up on the website shortly, which will give you a list of IGC countries. And then if you go onto the IGC website and you look at each country has a specific web page, you can also find contact information for the countries and the country economists, so you can get in touch with them.
So there's a question about project timelines and how long should project last?
There's no hard set rule on project timelines. Generally, on average, IGC projects last between 1 to 3 years. Very rarely do we have projects that go beyond the 3-year mark. And very rarely do we have projects that go below the 1-year mark as well. So I would say between 1 and 3 years is kind of average timeline.
Then there is someone asking whether master students are eligible for this call.
So typically we do not fund master students. The way we could fund master students is if master students collaborated with PhD students or more senior researchers, but not as a lead PI, but perhaps as a research associate. And so then we would have funding in there for the research associate. And so generally no, but high quality, high performing master students can work as RAs on projects.
Then there's a question about IGC funding RCTs. So yes, we do fund RCTs. And if yes, then what things should be kept in mind when designing and writing such a proposal?
You want to go for that?
Yeah, so I think the first is large-scale RCTs are expensive. So for this call, we're limiting at 20,000, which I think unless you're finding ways to run a lot of things in-house, will be hard. It will be hard to do an RCT for that cost. So that's probably the first thing to keep in mind for this call. It's possible, but it might be difficult to do a full RCT with that budget. The other thing to keep in mind is just being clear, kind of like everybody understand what an RCT is. So don't go too much over the methodology, but explain clearly kind of your interventions, explain whether you approach this RCT as being whether an intervention works, whether an intervention is cost effective, so you plan to do kind of cost benefit analysis at the end, or whether it's a kind of what I would call a mechanism RCT. So an RCT that is here to better understand mechanism rather than checking that an intervention works or is cost effective. So explain really what question you're trying to answer through your RCT, what are the different interventions, and probably that you're going to be powered to detect what you're trying to detect through the RCT.
Yeah, only one thing I'll add to that is because we're capping costs at 20K, like Matthieu said, I would encourage applicants to think about more cost-effective, more novel ways to capture data and collect data. So thinking beyond, your traditional kind of enumerators in the field asking, long surveys, 1 hour, 2 hour surveys, which can be very, very costly. So think a little bit out of the box about how you can collect data more cheaply.
I think we've gone through pretty much. So someone asked how to address the policy stakeholder question.
First thing I'll say is go back to the webinar that we just conducted on policy stakeholder engagement. That should give you some guidance on it. And then we will also have guidance in the application form on each question. So I would pay attention to that as well. I don't know, Matthieu, do you want to add anything?
No. I think the key is showing not only that you have a policy maker in mind who might be a client for the project, but also showing that either you've already engaged with that policymaker and that you have a good idea of what the channel to having policy impact might be. But you can refer to the webinar that we've done specifically on that. Yeah. Someone asked whether it is necessary to get and attach an official letter from the implementation partner with the proposal.
We don't require that. We've found in the past that getting letters of support can often be meaningless. But if you feel compelled to submit that with your application, please go ahead.
And then someone asked whether the co-PI, I think, on the proposal can be an emeritus professor for this call.
Yes, the co-PI, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's it. I can't see any new question popping into the chat.
Okay, great. I think we got through quite a few questions. Yeah, this is the last in the series of webinars. But I think for all participants, thank you so much for attending these. Good luck with putting together your proposals. We again strongly encourage you to, like Matthieu said, at least share a few lines, maybe a paragraph or two about your research idea with the IGC countries to then start a conversation about how to best put together a proposal that would be interesting for the IGC. So thanks everyone, and thanks Matthieu.
Thanks Shahid. Thanks everyone.
Thanks.